Hello, my name is Frank Crane. I'm a counselor at the Embry-Riddle Counseling Center, and my topic is reject perfection. Reject perfection. Now, not to sound contrarian here, but I think that perfection as we know it and celebrate it in our culture has become distorted. It often ends up, rather than being a cause for celebration and rejoicing and more creativity and joy, a force for gloom and doom and repression and guilt and shame. It has become weaponized. And let us look at how in particular. Let us say that I take a very difficult test and I get 100. I get everything right. Now, the tendency that we have, many of us, because I did so well on this test, because I got a perfect score, that says that I am a superior human being. The test score is what they call a virtue signal. It signals my virtue and worthwhileness as a person. By that same logic, if I didn't get 100 on that test, then I'm not such a good human being. I'm not as worth it, as worthwhile as the person who got 100. So perfect performance equals human value. That has been out there for a very long time, but it's never, ever been true. More closely at that. Okay, as we begin to explore this topic of perfection, let us begin with some example stories. And the first example story I'd like to show you is from the Renaissance. The great sculptor of that time, Michelangelo, created a sculpture of Moses, the great hero of the Old Testament. And the statue was absolutely beautiful. It was a magnificent piece of work. And Michelangelo himself was so taken with it that apparently, according to the story, he stood in front of the statue and he said, "Speak. What do you think happened?" Nothing happened. And nothing happened because, however beautiful and perfect they are, statues do not speak. People speak. Statues can't. It's not in their design, it's not in their job description. And so, again, Michelangelo was making this piece of work into more than it could ever possibly be, which I suppose is a natural failing, especially if you're a great genius like him and capable of such extreme achievement. But it gives you an instance of the kinds of defects, the kinds of faults you can find in this doctrine of perfection. When you make the work itself into a kind of statue of its own greatness or your own greatness. Okay, the second example story is from the movie Whiplash, which I believe came out in 2015, and I think it got at least one Academy Award. It's a rather dark story about a young man who wants to be a jazz drummer, and he goes to a very exclusive conservatory. And while he's there, he has an interview with Dr. Thatcher, the head of the jazz band. And he's sitting there in a little room with the professor, and he's at his drum set and he's working on the rhythm and he's hitting the pieces and he's demonstrating his skills and he's completely absorbed in his drumming when Professor Thatcher kind of steps up a little bit close to him And all of a sudden, Professor Thatcher hauls off and whacks him in the side of the head and knocks him off his stool. And the young man looks up in horror and surprise and looks, what happened? And Professor Thatcher communicates that his performance was not, fill in the blank, perfect. So this is a pretty extreme example of the cult of perfection, that maybe what one person thinks is a lack of perfection can become an excuse, a permission for violence, which is never true and never should be put into practice. But anyway, that was the doctrine according to Professor Fletcher at that moment, and there are many such people in the world. They do violence to others because of their so-called adherence to this so-called idea of perfection. Okay, let us go to the third story, and this is present time and real life. Simone Biles is probably the greatest gymnast in the world today, and she's probably the greatest gymnast who ever lived. And Simone Biles went to the Tokyo Olympics, and everyone expected her to do her signature moves and carry away gold medals and do amazing things. But Simone Biles became very aware of all the pressure that was on her to achieve, all that pressure of expectation that she would do these great signature moves and wipe everybody out. And she noticed as she was practicing what they call the twisties, which is when you are a gymnast and you're flying through the air doing somersaults and so forth, sometimes you lose your orientation. You're not sure whether you're facing up or down. And if that is the case, you can fall really ugly and you can hurt yourself. You can even die. So Simone Biles decided, nope, I'm not going to go this route. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm not going to go all out. I'm going to do the best with what I have, and I'm going to do some self-care. I think that's the right choice, and I think it's kind of a noble example. But that was Simone Biles in an extreme moment where she stepped back from quote unquote perfection and chose self-care, and I think rightly so. All right, now, with what is this thing called perfection? What is it that we all jump up and down about? Let me give you a reading from the Oxford American English Dictionary. Perfect, this is the word from which it comes. Perfect, having all the required or desirable elements, qualities, or characteristics. As good as it is possible to be. Okay, turn up your alarm systems. Here comes an example sentence. She strove to be the perfect wife. She strove to be the perfect wife. I wonder who is judging the perfection level of this woman, whether she qualifies. Perhaps Professor Thatcher or one of his spiritual kin? In too many situations, in too many instances in the world, this is exactly what's happening, and it's really toxic. Okay, let us begin to bring in the psychologists. Psychologists who talk about perfection and study it have identified three kinds of perfectionists, and let us look quickly at those people. So the first kind of perfectionist that they talk about is what they call the socially prescribed perfectionist. They're very self-critical. These people feel immense pressure to be the best. They worry what others will think about them. And the external standards, which can come from family, workplace, culture, society, team, what have you, can lead them to tremendous anxiety and low confidence. And I think we might be so bold to say that in this particular circumstance in the Olympics, Simone Biles was struggling with the challenge, the threat of becoming a socially prescribed perfectionist. But I don't know, but I think she fought back. And I think her fighting back was a triumph. Okay, let us look at the second type of perfectionist. This is the other oriented perfectionist. Perfectionists who are other oriented hold others in high standards, hold them to high standards, and they can be critical and judgmental, and they can be very, very destructive. Again, well, I can do violence on you if you don't do the perfect performance. You don't do perfect stuff, I will whack you in the head, figuratively or literally. And of course, Professor Thatcher in the second story is a prime example of this other-oriented perfectionist. The third type of perfectionist is the self-oriented perfectionist. And self-oriented perfectionists are organized and conscientious. They set high standards in their lives, and they're able to go after their goals. They're the most adaptive type of perfectionist, and often they have show great productivity and success, and they show high rates of positive emotion and motivation. But even this exemplary group sometimes has its inner demons, sometimes has its inner threats. And I think that probably, again, I'm wildly speculating here, but I'm thinking that Simone Biles, most of her career, was a self oriented perfectionist, setting challenges for herself, working to meet those challenges, judging her performance by her standards, and so on and so forth. But again, when you're working in that way, there's the threat of the judgment on yourself when it doesn't quite come out the way you want it, when the struggle is forefront rather than the achievement. Okay, now we've looked at the three types of perfectionists. Now let us look at some examples of perfectionistic behavior. Now, there is a wonderful scale called the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale, and it talks about four types of perfectionistic behavior. We're going to hear a little bit about each of these types. The first is concern over mistakes and doubts about actions. If I fail at work or school, I am a failure as a person. I'm a failure as a person. Again, what I do is who I am, which was never true, but in this competitive world of ours, it is. It's what a lot of people go by. Second example, if I should be upset if I make a mistake. Why? Well, because that would show that I'm not a good person, and so on. It's the old virtue signaling thing. If someone does a task at work or school better than I do, then I feel as if I failed the whole task. I'm just no good. And then finally here, if I fail partly, it is as bad as being a complete failure. It's that sort of absolutist perfectionism as virtue signaling. Okay, let us look at the second set of behaviors. This is excessive concern with parents' expectations and evaluation. So, my parents set very high standards for me. Okay, nothing wrong with that. As a child, I was punished for doing things less than perfectly. There it comes again. Punished for doing things less than perfectly. Okay. My parents never tried to understand my mistakes. No room in their world for getting anything less than perfect. And then my parents wanted me to be the best at everything. because then I could show how wonderful they were as parents. Look at this wonderful child that we raised. Virtue signaling. Okay. The next dimension is excessively high personal standards. If I do not set the highest personal standards for myself, I am likely to end up a second-rate person. So in certain universes, there are first-rate, second-rate, third-rate, and so on, levels of person. And how do we assess the level of the person? By their performance on arbitrary tests. Not very edifying. Okay, next example. It is important to me that I be thoroughly competent in what I do. Okay. Other people seem to accept lower standards for themselves than I do. Gee, I wonder why. Because they're not obsessed with this virtue signaling thing, perhaps. I expect higher performance in my daily tasks than most people, which means I suffer a lot more than most people, or probably, possibly anyway. So the high standards become part of the cross you bear when you're in the cult of perfectionism. Okay. Final category, concern with precision, order, and organization. um, Here's an example. Organization is very important to me. I am a neat person. I try to be an organized person. Neatness is very important to me. So, sounds relatively harmless, but what happens if things get out of order? What happens if your setup is a little bit sloppy? Do you freak, as they used to say? Is this dreadfully upsetting because it reflects on you as a human being? Well, very possibly. Okay, so we've noticed some aspects of the perfection concept and of the various things that go on in perfection world. And I know in the poster for this presentation, I put out the question, who hurt you? Because very often people that are perfectionists in that way, and probably even Professor Thatcher, if we had the opportunity to look into his psychology, and it's a fictional story, but if we had a character like that, we could analyze them. They were hurt in some way. In other words, somebody made fun of them for a bad performance. Somebody punished them because, according to the standard, it wasn't perfect, and so on. And so, what do you do if you are discovering that you were one of those people, that you have been hurt, and that you have this compulsion to be perfect, and you feel as if you can never, ever get there? There's a related concept in psychology called the imposter syndrome. And that's a basic feeling that I am a fake. I got into this excellent school by sheer chance or sheer luck, while all the other people in the school are fully qualified and know what they're doing all the time, but I don't know anything. I'm just faking it. I'm an imposter, and it's only a matter of time before they find me out. So I live in fear and dread, and I strive madly for perfection, and I suffer an awful, awful lot. Okay. So there's that, people who hurt you. There's the sense of you are no good. There's even the self-attacking, where maybe because people hurt you, maybe because you have these imposter feelings, you begin to criticize yourself, and you, as they say, beat yourself up. Part of you inside you is an enemy, or part of you inside has gone over to the enemy and is betraying you to the enemy so that they won't be punished. Something like that. Psychology is interesting. People are funny. But what if you find this discrepancy between your basic self, the way you deal with others, and the way you deal with yourself? Well, this whole dimension has been explored in psychology, in particular in an area called mindful self-compassion, which goes all the way back to Buddhism. And these Buddhist teachings have been adopted to psychotherapy. So here's an example of a self-compassionate approach to that syndrome of never good enough, something wrong, and so forth. So the question, the name of the exercise is, how would you treat a friend? So think about times when a close friend feels really bad about him or herself, or is really struggling in some way. How would you respond to your friend in this situation? Especially when you're at your best. So write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you typically talk to your friends. So you might want to make a few notes about that right now. Okay, now think about times when you feel bad about yourself or are struggling. How do you typically respond to yourself in these situations? So please write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you talk to yourself. Now, the biggie. Did you notice a difference? If so, ask yourself why. What factors or fears come into play that lead you to treat yourself and others so differently? Well, perhaps you're a perfection addict. Perhaps you were hurt. Perhaps you were invalidated as a person because of some performance that was forced on you. So this is matter for reflection, for meditation, perhaps for therapy. Well, it's also material for future action. And in the final step of this process, Professor Neff says, please write down how you think things might change if you responded to yourself in the same way you typically respond to a close friend when they're suffering. Treat yourself as you would treat a close friend. This can be mind-blowing. It can be world-changing. And it has a huge potential for good, and it has a huge potential for ease of putting into action. It's simple. Again, you can start it. Sticking with it might be hard. There might be difficult emotions and so on, but it's well worth doing. And if we look at this particular exercise, it goes to some very deep principles that are found in Buddhism that I think are found in all the great um, religions and humanistic philosophies. And let us quickly look at those. First, we have the idea of mindfulness. And mindfulness is simply being aware of what's there, particularly what emotions are there inside of you. So, for example, you might notice what's going on inside you and you say, oh, this is a moment of suffering. This is pain. I'm experiencing it. You don't try to push it away. You don't make excuses. You don't run madly screaming and yelling, looking for relief. You just sit with it. And you try to be with it and you try to understand what is going on. You take some time. Okay. The second dimension is what is called common humanity. So, yes, I'm suffering. That's my mindfulness talking. And suffering is a part of life. As one writer once put it, anything that can happen to a person can happen to me. So I need to accept this fact of human life, and I need to forgive myself when I am suffering and struggling with this, because this is something we all deal with at some time or other. Okay. And then the final dimension is kindness. Given that we are mindful of suffering, given that suffering is a part of life, we need to be kind to ourselves as we are kind to others. We need to will the good, as they used to put it, for other people. So we have traditional Buddhist expectations and prayers like, may I give myself the compassion that I need. May I accept myself as I am. May I learn to accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong. May I be patient. And the interesting thing is, it's very bare bones, but it really works if you're willing to listen to yourself and understand. So, the problem of a kind of bogus virtue signaling perfectionism can be met, can be healed, if you will, by self compassion, mindfulness, understanding of common humanity, and an approach based on kindness. Okay, so we are looking at perhaps a key, at least a clue, to healing. So, what do we do if we're not striving in the old virtue signaling way of perfection? What's left? Well, in the world of post perfection, the unperfectionist world, we are doing what has been done very successfully in a lot of business enterprises, for example. So, if you look at the work of William Deming, he was one of the great business gurus of the 1950s and 60s. He developed what has been called the Deming Cycle. So I don't know, you have a business and you want to get better. You want to get better results. So you uh, observe what you're doing and you make a plan to get things better, to do better. Then you put the plan in motion. He calls that the do phase. Plan, then you do. And the third phase, which is also going on while you're doing, is the study phase. You observe the feedback that you're getting. You observe the way the data are coming in. You begin to look at the results. And then the fourth phase, act. You put it all together, you analyze the data, you see the ways in which you can be better, and you go for it again. It's a cycle. And you will be on this cycle for as long as you want to. And as long as you are improving and getting the feedback and implementing the feedback, you will be getting better and better. You will be part of a philosophy of continuous improvement. You're not afraid of mistakes. You're not afraid of loss to your ego if something doesn't quite go right, or if something goes too well and then you suddenly think of yourself as the world conquering hero. No, none of this. It's simply data, careful research, careful work, careful analysis of feedback, and keep going. Keep going. Okay. Now, there's a simpler version to this improvement, and the Deming cycle is what's called uh, focus, feedback, fix it. That's from the great psychologist Anders Ericsson. So you focus on what you have to do, you get the feedback, and then you fix. You do what's necessary. Perhaps even an even simpler approach to this process is from a psychologist at West Point who says to his athletes, uh, what, so what, and now what? Okay, so what happened in my performance there? What happened? What went on? Was it good, bad, indifferent, and what have you? So what? Is this important? Should I pay attention to this? Is this a win? And so on. And you analyze, determine what's what there, and then now what? Based on the data, I implement a plan to do it better. This is what I do now, and on, round and round. Okay, so if we heed the input from these experts, I think we have a less stressful, a less toxic, actually a much more positive and healthy approach to striving and improvement. It's based on science. It's based on facts. There's no shame. There's no blame. Okay. Which brings to mind a famous British psychiatrist named Donald Winnicott. And he was active in the 50s and 60s, and he studied parenting. And he wrote some very, very interesting essays and reports about mothers and how they interacted with their children. And he talks about the perfect mother. The perfect mother always anticipates the child's need. The perfect mother is always there for the child all the time. The perfect mother always knows what next, what to do next with the child. The perfect mother is always, 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 always perfectly responsible to every possible eventuality that might come up with the child. So what? Well, what it comes down to, as Winnicott found out, was that the perfect mother, in a way, crushes the child because the child does not have any opportunity to express individuality, to make a mistake from which he or she might learn, to experiment on their own, and so on and so forth. So then he began to think about, well, what about the good enough mother? Well, the good enough mother is, first of all, not perfect. The good enough mother sometimes leaves the child in the lurch. The good enough mother sometimes does the wrong thing, which upsets the child. The good enough mother is not always there at every moment with the right thing. And that fact alone means that the child sometimes have to fend for themselves, sometimes have to figure things out. But there's a very interesting feature here because deep down, the child loves the mother. Deep down, the mother loves the child, even though they both have these little areas of failure. And so the child, in this struggle of growth and learning and trying and sometimes failing and making things up, the child adapts, as does the mother. I adapt to you, you adapt to me. Our relationship grows and develops. And it's kind of like that old story in the old story of Goldilocks, where the little girl sees the three chairs and sits in one that's too small, sits in the other one that's way too big, and then finds another chair and it's just right. So this type of work with the imperfect mother and the imperfect child, because everybody's imperfect and life is imperfect, this developmental process becomes good enough. And the good enough person is flexible, adaptable, improving, and capable of getting on with life. So let us keep that in mind when we hold perfection at arm's length and evaluate what we want to do with those ideals of improvement. And let us work together. Let us adapt to the world. Let us adapt to the challenges. Let us adapt to one another and hope that with time, we'll all be good enough. Thank you. I'm going to turn it off now.